Some people walk into your home with smiles, believing your kindness is a weakness to exploit. When I found my sister's in-laws sipping my wine and scattering transfer contracts across my desk, I did not scream. Sometimes, the silence of a woman pushed to her limit is the most terrifying sound. If you have ever been manipulated by so-called family, listen closely. The way these parasites paid for their arrogance will make you unable to look away. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Savannah Hicks. I am 34 years old, and for the past 10 years, my entire professional life has been dedicated to untangling the webs of deception that people weave. As a forensic auditor and a lead cybersecurity architect for Aegis Vanguard Analytics, a premier intelligence and security firm, my daily existence revolves around structure, logic, and cold, hard facts. I specialize in hunting down corporate embezzlers, securing digital perimeters, and dismantling complex financial frauds. I build fortresses for a living, both in the digital space and in my personal life. Therefore, my home in Seattle is my ultimate sanctuary, a meticulously controlled environment where I dictate the rules. I never could have imagined that the most brazen breach of my security would not come from a faceless hacker in a distant country, but from the very people who called themselves family. The relentless Seattle rain drummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the windows of my car as I rode home from the airport. I had wrapped up my responsibilities at an international security conference in San Francisco exactly 2 days ahead of schedule. Rather than stay for the networking events, I chose to return early. There was no specific reason, just an inexplicable, heavy feeling in my chest urging me to get back. When I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, the house felt fundamentally wrong. My home was usually a haven of quiet comfort, scented with cedar and espresso. Today, the silence was unnatural. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that made my instincts flare instantly. I left my suitcase by the coat rack, not making a sound, and moved cautiously down the hardwood hallway. I stopped near the bottom of the staircase, listening intently. From the kitchen counter, the soft, static hum of a baby monitor broke the silence. Through the speaker, I could hear the rhythmic, peaceful breathing of my 2-year-old nephew, Liam. He was fast asleep in the upstairs nursery, safely tucked away in his crib, completely undisturbed by whatever was happening below. That brought me a brief wave of relief. But the relief was shattered seconds later by the muffled sound of weeping coming from the back of the house. I walked silently toward my private study. The heavy oak door had been pushed open, leaving a wide gap. When I stepped into the doorway, the scene playing out inside my personal sanctuary made my blood run ice cold. My younger sister, Chloe, was slumped over on my velvet reading sofa. Her face was buried deep in her hands, and her entire body shook with violent, desperate sobs. She looked utterly defeated, backed into a corner in a house that did not even belong to her abusers. Sitting directly across from her, acting as if they owned the very floorboards beneath their feet, were Richard and Eleanor Vance, Chloe's in-laws. Richard had commandeered my custom leather executive chair behind my mahogany desk, slouching in it with infuriating arrogance. Spread haphazardly across my pristine workspace was a mountain of legal folders, tax files, and financial agreements. From where I stood, my trained eyes easily caught the bold black text on the top pages. They were power of attorney documents and commercial mortgage contracts, all directly tied to a highly lucrative commercial building in the center of downtown Seattle. It was a prime piece of real estate that I owned 100% outright. Eleanor was standing near the edge of the desk. She was holding one of my imported crystal glasses, taking a slow, leisurely sip of my expensive vintage wine. She wore a nauseatingly sweet smile, reaching out to pat Chloe's trembling shoulder. She was putting on a brilliant performance of a caring, gentle mother offering tough but necessary advice. Yet her eyes betrayed her. They were devoid of empathy, gleaming with the dark, hungry calculation of a scavenger picking at defenseless prey. I stepped fully into the room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. The sound cut through the room like a whip. "What exactly are you doing in my office?" I asked. My voice was not loud. It was terrifyingly calm, stripped of all emotion and warmth. Richard slowly lifted his head. He did not look startled, nor did he display an ounce of shame for trespassing in my home and going through my private documents. Instead, he picked up a pen from my desk, tapped it aggressively against the wood, and glared at me with pure, unfiltered condescension. "This is an internal family matter," Richard sneered, his voice thick with patriarchal authority. "It does not concern you. Please step outside so we can work with Chloe." Any normal person would have exploded. They would have screamed, thrown the glass against the wall, or immediately dialed emergency services to report a break-in. I did neither. When you spend your life studying the psychology of predators, you learn that anger is a vulnerability. Reacting with rage only tells them that they have successfully affected you. I did not lose my temper. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned around, placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the office door, and pulled it shut. I reached up and turned the deadbolt. The sharp, heavy click of the lock locking us inside echoed loudly in the tense air. As I turned back around, my gaze swept over the paperwork on the desk one more time, and the entire malicious scheme crystallized in my mind. Years ago, when Chloe was trying to build her financial portfolio, I had legally granted her an honorary co-management title on the company that held the building. It was a gesture of sisterly trust, meant only to boost her credit and resume. It carried no real operational weight without my signature, but it looked official on paper. These people had somehow found out about it. Now they were systematically breaking down a terrified, emotionally drained young mother, trying to force her to use that honorary title to mortgage my property without my knowledge. I looked at Richard's smug, demanding face, and then at Eleanor's fake, comforting smile. A dark, quiet thought took root in the back of my mind. These arrogant invaders had absolutely no idea who they had just provoked. They thought they had cornered a weak victim in an empty house. They failed to realize that they had just walked willingly into the jaws of a trap, and I was going to ensure that they never walked out of this mess intact. The sharp click of the deadbolt sliding into place hung in the air, a physical manifestation of the trap snapping shut. Richard shifted in my chair, his posture stiffening infinitesimally. He had anticipated a storm. Men of his particular breed, those who rely on intimidation masquerading as authority, always expect women to react with chaotic emotion. They want the tears, the screaming, the frantic pacing, the loss of control. It gives them the high ground. It allows them to sigh, shake their heads, and play the role of the calm, rational patriarch managing a hysterical, unreasonable female. I denied him that satisfaction. My face remained an unreadable mask as I walked slowly toward my own desk. I did not glare at him. I did not rush my steps. I moved with the deliberate, measured grace of someone who was entirely in control of her environment. I reached out, picked up the thick stack of legal documents he had arranged so presumptuously across my blotter, and began to slowly turn the pages. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and profoundly uncomfortable, broken only by the crisp, methodical rustle of high-quality paper. Eleanor, sensing that her husband's brute force approach was failing to elicit the desired emotional response, decided it was time to deploy her weapon of choice, weaponized maternal guilt. "Savannah, darling, please try to understand the position we are in," Eleanor purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she set my crystal wine glass down on a coaster. "Marcus is just experiencing some temporary cash flow difficulties. The global shipping delays and sudden tariff shifts have been terribly hard on his luxury import and export business. It is just a minor, unforeseen bottleneck. We are simply asking Chloe to leverage her position to secure a short-term bridge loan. It is merely a formality to keep the supply chains moving. Family must know how to sacrifice for one another in times of need. That is what family does. We hold each other up. I kept my eyes trained on the legal jargon in front of me. Temporary cash flow difficulties. It was the classic textbook euphemism of the desperate white-collar criminal trying to cover a hemorrhaging wound with a generic bandage. A bridge loan, I repeated softly, my tone completely neutral, betraying zero hostility. I see. And what is the exact debt-to-equity ratio you are looking to secure against the property's current market valuation? Traditional commercial lenders usually cap out at 65% for a secondary mortgage position, especially in the current volatile economic climate. Richard scoffed loudly, leaning back in my chair, eager to assert his intellectual and business dominance over a younger woman. We are not using a traditional sluggish bank, Savannah. We are bypassing the endless bureaucratic red tape. We have secured highly favorable terms with a private credit fund, Apex Capital Solutions. They are willing to underwrite the loan at an 80% loan-to-value ratio, provided the title is completely clear and the co-manager signs off today. Apex Capital, I said, committing the name to my mental ledger. That is highly aggressive. Their mezzanine debt structures usually carry a 12 to 15% interest rate, coupled with extremely severe predatory default clauses. Who exactly is your primary broker over there? A transaction of this magnitude and speed would require a senior underwriter pulling significant strings. A man named Thomas Sterling, Richard boasted, a smug, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He is a close personal friend of my network. He is personally rushing the compliance and background checks for us. The accounts will be fully funded within 48 hours of Chloe signing these papers right here. He was so incredibly eager to prove he was a seasoned, connected businessman that he did not realize he was bleeding critical, highly sensitive intelligence. He had just handed me the exact name of the shadow fund, the specific loan-to-value metric they were aiming for, and the internal corporate contact orchestrating the illicit deal. As he spoke his own demise into existence, I shifted my weight slightly. My right foot slid carefully beneath the heavy mahogany desk, finding a very specific, seemingly innocuous knot in the wood of the modesty panel. I pressed my toe against it with precise, calculated pressure. A silent, localized vibration pulsed against the sole of my shoe, confirming activation. My home was not just a beautiful house, it was a hardened fortress designed by a paranoid cybersecurity architect. I had just initiated the room's concealed high-fidelity audio recording system and triggered an immediate encrypted data backup sequence routing straight to my secure off-site servers. Every single breath and word spoken in this room was now immutable digital evidence. Chloe, sitting curled up on the sofa behind me, let out a choked, ragged sob. She looked up, her eyes red, swollen, and filled with sheer terror. Savannah, I did not want to agree to this. They said Marcus would lose absolutely everything. They said the business would go under and... I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with my sister, and raised a single index finger to my lips. The gesture was completely silent but carried absolute, uncompromising authority. Chloe's mouth snapped shut instantly. She swallowed hard, nodded frantically, and curled further into the corner of the velvet cushions. I turned my attention back to the man sitting in my seat. You are currently occupying my chair. You are trespassing in my private workspace. I am going to ask you and your wife to leave my property this exact second. I tapped the top of the document stack with a manicured fingernail. I will be keeping this duplicate copy of the paperwork. I need to study the fine print thoroughly before any further discussions of any kind occur. Richard's face darkened instantly. The thin, polished veneer of the sophisticated businessman peeling away to reveal the desperate thug hiding underneath. He stood up abruptly, planting his hands on the desk and leaning forward. attempting to use his physical size to cast a shadow of intimidation over me. "You are making a massive, catastrophic mistake, little girl," Richard growled, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing register. "If you stand in the way of this family surviving this hurdle, Marcus will have no choice but to file for divorce. Chloe will be cast out and left with absolutely nothing. And that precious little boy sleeping upstairs? He will grow up without a father. Do you really want the destruction of your sister's family on your conscience?" He truly thought he was delivering a masterful, devastating ultimatum. He thought invoking a broken marriage, financial ruin, and a fatherless child would force my emotional hand. He was catastrophically wrong. In the cold, calculating logic of my mind, Richard Vance had not just issued a hollow threat. He had officially signed his entire family's death warrant. The game was no longer simply about protecting a real estate asset. It was about their absolute and total eradication. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. Their footsteps faded down the driveway, followed by the aggressive roar of Richard's luxury sedans speeding away. The air in the house immediately felt lighter. I went to the kitchen and brewed a cup of chamomile tea. I returned to the living room, pressed the warm ceramic mug into Chloe's trembling hands, and draped a heavy woven blanket over her shoulders. I told her she was safe now. Then, I walked up the stairs to the nursery. Liam was still breathing softly in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm, completely oblivious to the monsters that had just stood directly beneath him. I gently brushed a curl from his forehead. Once I knew they were secure, I went back downstairs, stepped into my office, and locked the door. The time for observation was over. It was time to hunt. I sat down at my desk and booted up my primary workstation. I bypassed my standard home network, initiating a secure, heavily encrypted tunnel directly into the Aegis Vanguard Analytics mainframe. The ambient lights in the room shifted to a cool blue as the monitors flared to life. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. No wasted movements, just short, sharp, lethal keystrokes. Logic, data, truth. I laid out the duplicate contracts Richard had left behind. I meticulously extracted the routing numbers, the corporate shell entities, the tax identification numbers, and the specific reference codes tied to Apex Capital Solutions. I fed the raw data into our proprietary forensic tracing algorithms. It took exactly 4 hours. 4 hours to slice through layers of sophisticated digital smoke and mirrors. 4 hours to unmask a staggering web of financial deceit. The data painted a picture so vile it made my stomach turn. There was no temporary cash flow difficulty. There were no global shipping delays or sudden tariff shifts. Those were carefully rehearsed lies designed to manipulate a vulnerable wife. The truth was a financial bloodbath. Richard and Marcus Vance had not just mismanaged their luxury import business, they had actively, systematically bled it dry. Over the past 18 months, father and son had secretly funneled millions of dollars out of their own company. But they did not take it from operational profits. They took it directly from the employee retirement pension funds. They had stolen the life savings of the very people who spent decades building their company, and they had dumped every single stolen penny into a highly volatile, completely fraudulent offshore cryptocurrency project. They thought they were financial geniuses. Instead, the unregulated market crashed, the developers vanished, and the scam collapsed overnight. The money evaporated. The Vance family had lost absolutely everything. But the impending disaster did not stop there. The digital trail I uncovered was currently flashing with urgent, severe warning indicators. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service had already caught the scent. Automated federal banking algorithms had flagged the massive, unexplained capital hemorrhage from the corporate accounts. The agencies were circling like sharks in bloody water. A comprehensive, merciless federal audit was officially scheduled to hit the Vance corporate ledgers next week. The Vance men were drowning in panic. They desperately needed a colossal influx of clean, untraceable cash to plug the gaping multi-million-dollar hole in the pension fund before the federal agents walked through their doors. That was why they needed my commercial building. It was a massive, pristine, debt-free asset. They wanted to use it to secure an emergency cash payout, hoping to replace the stolen retirement funds just in time to pass the audit. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence of the house was shattered by the shrill ringing of Chloe's cellular phone. The caller ID flashed Marcus's name. She looked at me, paralyzed with fear. I picked up the device, accepted the call, and put it on speakerphone, motioning for her to stay completely silent. He was sobbing. It was not a quiet, dignified sadness. It was the pathetic, wet, gasping tears of a coward who had finally been cornered. "Chloe, please," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking and whining through the speaker. "You have to sign the papers tomorrow. You have to. I am so sorry. My parents pushed me into this deal. They made me do it. I had no other choice. Please just help me fix this. I love you." I reached out and severed the connection, immediately blocking his number from her device. I looked at the dark screen, and the sheer, unadulterated evil of their master plan finally clicked into place. It hit me with the force of a freight train. This was never just about stealing my real estate. If Chloe had signed those documents using her honorary co-manager title, her digital signature and legal identity would have been permanently bound to the fraudulent loan. When the federal authorities inevitably raided the company and traced the massive influx of cash, they would look directly at the signatures. They would see my sister as the primary architect of a massive money laundering operation. They were setting her up. They fully intended to frame Chloe, sacrificing her to the wolves to save their own skin. She would go to federal prison as the fall guy, and the United States government would seize my commercial building as an asset born from financial crimes. A cold, absolute fury settled over me. They wanted to play a game of destruction. Fine. I was going to rewrite the rules. I could have picked up the telephone right then, dialed emergency services, and handed the entire digital footprint over to the federal authorities. It would have been fast and highly efficient. But efficiency would not heal the deep psychological scars the Vance family had inflicted on my sister. For years, they had systematically broken Chloe down, making her feel small, dependent, and entirely at their mercy. If the police simply arrested them in the middle of the night, Chloe would always carry that lingering fear in the back of her mind. She needed to see them fall from their highest pedestal. She needed to watch their grand illusion of absolute power shatter into millions of pieces. I had to completely eradicate the root of their manipulation. By 7 o'clock the next morning, I drafted an electronic mail to Richard. I stripped away every ounce of my professional dignity and composed a message dripping with manufactured submission. I wrote that I was terrified of ruining my sister's marriage and tearing a father away from his infant son. I explicitly stated that I was letting my familial emotions guide my better judgment, and I humbly requested a formal meeting to discuss the final terms before signing the property transfer agreements. The response arrived in less than 15 minutes. They swallowed the bait whole. Men like Richard Vance possess an ego so fragile and inflated that they actively crave subservience. He fully believed his pathetic threats had broken my resolve. In his twisted mind, women ultimately always surrendered to emotional pressure and patriarchal authority. Bursting with triumphant arrogance, he dictated the terms of our surrender. He scheduled the signing ceremony for noon on Thursday at the Oakwood Reserve, the most exclusive, ridiculously overpriced private golf club in the greater Seattle area. He specifically reserved the executive lounge, a room chosen entirely to intimidate us with his perceived wealth and social dominance. He wanted us to feel incredibly small while handing over my commercial asset. I utilized the next 48 hours with lethal, unyielding precision. I isolated myself in my secure office, fueled by black coffee and cold fury. I systematically compiled every single shred of digital forensic evidence I had extracted from their compromised servers. I packaged the illegal offshore cryptocurrency transaction logs, mapping out the exact trajectory of every stolen dollar. I cross-referenced the routed pension fund account numbers with the fake corporate shell entities they had created to hide the theft. I even included certified transcripts of the frantic, extorting voice messages Marcus had left for Chloe. I bound everything into a dense, meticulously organized physical dossier. It was an undeniable, ironclad portfolio of severe financial crimes. Once the file was perfectly assembled, I made a highly confidential phone call. I reached out to a close former colleague from my intelligence days, a man who currently served as a senior supervisory special agent for the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I securely transmitted the entire encrypted data package directly to his secure server. I gave him the exact time, the specific private dining room number, and the precise address of the golf club where the Vances planned to finalize their criminal conspiracy. My friend reviewed the preliminary data while we were on the line, chuckled darkly into the receiver, and promised me that his tactical team would be ready and waiting. The morning of the meeting finally arrived. The heavy Seattle fog had lifted, revealing a cold, starkly bright day. I walked downstairs to find Chloe waiting for me in the foyer. She was no longer the trembling, weeping girl huddled in the corner of my sofa. She had pulled her hair back into a severe, elegant knot and wore a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal business suit. The paralyzing fear in her eyes had burned away entirely, replaced by a hardened, quiet resolve. She had made the conscious decision to stop running and stop hiding. She was finally ready to face her abusers. We safely dropped little Liam off at the home of my trusted, longtime nanny, a fierce woman who loved that boy like her own flesh and blood. Knowing he was completely shielded from the impending fallout, my sister and I got into my car. We drove in absolute, focused silence toward the opulent country club. Richard and Eleanor believed we were walking blindly into their grand tiger's den to offer ourselves as a sacrifice. They were blissfully unaware that we were the ones bringing the cage. The private executive dining room at the Oakwood Reserve smelled of polished mahogany, expensive aged bourbon, and unearned entitlement. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Richard sat at the head of the massive conference table, positioned perfectly to overlook the pristine 18th hole of the golf course. He wore a custom-tailored navy blue suit, looking every bit the triumphant conqueror holding court. Marcus sat to his right, fidgeting slightly with his crystal water goblet, though he tried his best to mirror his father's arrogant posture. Eleanor was perched gracefully on the plush leather chair to Richard's left, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When Chloe and I entered the room, Richard did not even bother to stand up. He simply gestured lazily toward the two empty chairs situated at the opposite end of the long table, treating us like insubordinate employees who had finally been brought to heel. "Have a seat, girls," Richard commanded, his voice echoing loudly in the spacious room. We sat down in unison. I placed my leather briefcase on the floor next to my feet. Richard immediately leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood. With a theatrical, overly dramatic flourish, he slid a thick, bound contract across the long table. It came to a stop directly in front of me. He followed it by sliding a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen, watching it spin to a halt right next to the signature line. His face was split into a massive, sickeningly victorious smile. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought he had successfully bullied his way into ownership of a multi-million-dollar commercial asset. "It is incredibly good to see that you finally came to your senses, Savannah," Richard said, lacing his fingers together. "I knew that deep down, you were a reasonable woman. All of the necessary transfer clauses have been finalized and fully notarized on our end. All that remains is for you and Chloe to provide your authorized signatures on the final page. Then, this unfortunate little misunderstanding will be permanently resolved." Eleanor leaned into the table, her eyes practically shining with greedy anticipation. She reached out and patted the air in our direction. "We just want to say how incredibly proud we are of both of you," Eleanor cooed, her voice dripping with toxic manufactured affection. "This is a truly great sacrifice. You are proving what it actually means to be a part of this family. We always knew Chloe was a loyal wife, and Savannah, you are showing such remarkable maturity. Once this minor financial hurdle is cleared, we will all look back on this and laugh. We will be stronger than ever." I looked at the gold pen resting on the table. I did not touch it. I did not even look at the contract. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, mirroring Eleanor's posture perfectly, and let the silence stretch. 10 seconds passed, then 20 seconds. The smug smiles on their faces began to falter, replaced by a creeping, uneasy confusion. "Well," Richard barked, his artificial patience evaporating instantly. "Pick up the pen. We have a tea time in 30 minutes, and I do not intend to miss it. Sign the paper." "I am afraid there has been a slight miscalculation on your part," I said softly, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I leaned down, unsnapped the brass locks of my briefcase, and pulled out a massive, heavily bound dossier. It was 3 inches thick, crammed with printed data logs, financial charts, and certified legal affidavits. I lifted it high and slammed it down onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Emblazoned across the thick front cover, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, was the official seal of the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Richard stared at the seal, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What kind of ridiculous stunt is this?" he demanded, though a slight tremor had entered his voice. "You see, Richard," I began, folding my hands back together, "when you boldly declared that you were bypassing traditional banks to use an aggressive private credit fund, you felt incredibly powerful. You thought you were flexing your superior business connections. But you overlooked one critical detail. When you funnel stolen employee pension funds through a labyrinth of fake offshore shell companies, you need a highly sophisticated enterprise encryption software to mask the digital money trail from government regulators." Marcus suddenly stopped fidgeting. His entire body went rigidly still. "Your company utilizes a proprietary data cloaking architecture called the Obsidian Protocol," I continued, speaking clearly and deliberately, ensuring every single syllable hit them like a physical blow. "It is a very expensive, very elite digital security software. The problem, Richard, is that you never bothered to research who exactly built it." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "My department at Aegis Vanguard Analytics designed the Obsidian Protocol from the ground up. I am the lead architect. I wrote the core source code. And because I operate in the intelligence sector, I permanently hardwired a heavily encrypted backdoor access channel into the very foundation of the software for national security emergencies." The color began to rapidly drain from Richard's face. The robust, healthy red flush of the arrogant golfer was replaced by a sickly ashen gray. "From the exact second you sat in my office and bragged about your shadow fund, you handed me the keys to your entire criminal kingdom," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I did not need to hack you. I simply walked through the back door you paid my firm to build. I have spent the last 48 hours pulling every single digital ledger, every routed offshore account, and every erased cryptocurrency transaction you thought was hidden." Marcus let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. His hand violently spasmed, knocking against his crystal water goblet. It tipped over and shattered completely against the hardwood floor, sending shards of glass and ice water splashing across the expensive rug. He did not even look down. He was staring at me with pure, unadulterated horror. "That document you just slid across the table?" I pointed at their contract. "That was never a lifeline. That was the final piece of the puzzle. I needed you to formally present a fraudulent commercial mortgage application in a documented setting. By handing this to me today, you just provided the federal government with physical, undeniable proof of your active intent to commit massive wire fraud and launder stolen pension funds. They finally understood. The realization crashed over them like a tidal wave. They had not lured a helpless woman into a trap. They had been meticulously lured into an execution chamber of their own making. "You vicious, calculating bitch!" Richard roared. The thin veneer of the civilized businessman completely vanished, replaced by the cornered, rabid animal he truly was. He lunged violently across the wide mahogany table, his hands grasping desperately for the thick federal dossier. He knocked over chairs and scattered the contract papers, his face twisted in pure homicidal rage. He intended to tear the evidence to shreds, to physically destroy the truth, and then to destroy me. He never even made it halfway across the table. Before his grasping fingers could touch the folder, the heavy double doors of the VIP lounge burst open with explosive force. Wood splintered against the wall. 4 heavily armed federal agents, dressed in stark black tactical suits and windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stormed into the room. "Federal agents, do not move. Keep your hands where I can see them right now," the lead agent commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority as he flashed a gold badge. 2 agents immediately flanked the table, grabbing Richard by the shoulders and forcefully throwing him back against the wall. They kicked his legs apart and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic, ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking into place echoed rapidly through the room. Another agent hauled a sobbing, hyperventilating Marcus out of his chair, cuffing him instantly. "Richard Vance and Marcus Vance," the lead agent read from a formal document, his voice cold and detached. "You are both under arrest for multiple counts of federal financial fraud, wire fraud, grand larceny, and the embezzlement of employee pension funds. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The scene was absolute chaos. Richard was violently thrashing against the agents, his face purple with rage, screaming obscenities and demanding to call his lawyers. Marcus was weeping uncontrollably, his knees giving out entirely, forcing the agent to physically drag him toward the exit. Amidst the total collapse of their empire, Eleanor stood frozen. Her perfectly curated, wealthy socialite persona had utterly shattered. Her makeup was running down her face as tears streamed from her panicked eyes. She watched her husband and son being hauled away like common street thugs. In her absolute desperation, she turned toward the only person she thought she could still manipulate. Eleanor lunged toward Chloe, her hands reaching out to grab my sister's tailored jacket. "Chloe! Chloe, please!" Eleanor wailed, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched shriek. "You have to stop them. Tell them it is a mistake. You are family. You have to save Marcus. Please do something." Chloe did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply looked down at the desperate woman clawing at her arm. With a slow, deliberate, and incredibly powerful motion, Chloe coldly pulled her arm away, breaking Eleanor's frantic grip entirely. Chloe looked directly into her mother-in-law's tear-streaked face, her expression harder than solid stone, and delivered the final, fatal blow. "This is an internal family matter," Chloe said quietly. "It does not concern me." Several months passed after that explosive afternoon at the Oakwood Reserve. Without the massive influx of stolen funds to plug the catastrophic holes in their ledger, the Vance family's artificial business empire collapsed completely. The federal government moved in and seized everything they owned. Richard Vance, the man who truly believed he could bully the entire world into submission, was convicted on multiple federal charges. The judge showed zero leniency, sentencing him to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His pristine, custom-tailored suits were permanently replaced by standard-issue prison uniforms. Marcus, completely broken and terrified of serving a long, harsh sentence, immediately turned against his own father. He accepted a comprehensive plea agreement, testifying for the federal prosecution in exchange for a significantly reduced sentence of just 36 months in a minimum security facility. However, as part of that strict plea deal, the federal judge permanently banned Marcus from ever holding a corporate officer position or operating any commercial business for the rest of his natural life. Eleanor was left with absolutely nothing. Her luxurious lifestyle vanished overnight, and she was forced to move into a tiny, subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city, entirely shunned by the wealthy social circles she once desperately clung to. The divorce proceedings were incredibly swift and quiet. Marcus possessed absolutely zero financial assets and possessed even less moral standing to contest anything in court. He surrendered full, uncontested legal and physical custody of Liam to Chloe without a single fight. When the legal team asked if my sister wanted to file for spousal support, Chloe smiled and firmly declined. She refused to take a single penny of their filthy, blood-stained money. She wanted a clean break, severing every possible tie to that nightmare. Instead, using a small, fiercely protected savings account she had hidden away, combined with a quiet financial investment from me, Chloe finally pursued the beautiful dream her former in-laws had constantly mocked and forbidden. She opened a bright, sunlit artisanal bakery in a quiet, welcoming neighborhood. She traded the suffocating pressure of pleasing her abusers for the warm, comforting scent of fresh yeast, vanilla, and baked sugar. For the very first time in her adult life, she was entirely her own boss, answering to absolutely no one but herself. Little Liam is growing up surrounded by an impenetrable wall of love. He is safe, wildly happy, and completely untainted by the toxic, consuming greed that destroyed his father's side of the family. He spends his afternoons happily covered in white flour at his mother's bakery, or building elaborate wooden block towers in my living room. He will never know the cold manipulation of the people who saw his existence only as a convenient bargaining chip. On a particularly warm Sunday afternoon, my sister and I sat together on the wooden deck of my backyard. We sipped cold iced tea and watched Liam stumble happily through the tall green grass, giggling uncontrollably as he tried to catch a bright yellow butterfly. I looked over at Chloe. The heavy dark shadows that used to haunt her eyes were entirely gone. She threw her head back and laughed at something Liam did, and her smile was utterly radiant. It was not the fragile, nervous smile she used to wear around Eleanor. It was the deep, grounded, beautiful smile of a woman who had fought a terrifying war for her absolute freedom and won. Watching them, I realized a profound truth. A home is not simply a collection of sturdy walls, an expensive roof, or a portfolio of valuable commercial assets. It is a sacred fortress designed to protect the people you love. Predators like the Vance family believe they can use the holy disguise of the word family to bypass the gates and freely invade that fortress. They expect you to lay down your weapons in the name of peace and familial duty. But they make one fatal, devastating miscalculation. They forget that there are women in this world who would much rather burn the entire earth to the ground than let anyone hurt their flesh and blood. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.